Good morning and welcome to this new EPC Friday update, our weekly look at the key developments on COVID-19 and the implications for Europe's economy, society, its global order, and for European politics in general. My name is Jacki Davis, Senior Advisor to the European Policy Centre, and I'll be with you every week to moderate this discussion. And every Friday, the EPC's senior analysts are going to share with you their online, their assessment of what's happened during the week, the key developments. They'll evaluate some of those measures that have been taken and that are emerging, and they will consider the longer term future. What does all this mean for the European Union when we come out of this crisis? With me for the first in our new series are EPC Chief Executive Fabian Zuleeg and EPC's Director of Studies, Janis A. And today we're going to assess where we are so far. So overall, what is the state of affairs in terms of Europe's response to the crisis? We're going to very specifically look at what happened yesterday in the teleconference between EU leaders, preceded by discussions among finance ministers, and look more broadly at some other developments and knock-on impacts. For example, what is the potential impact of all of this on the negotiations on the next EU budget? And what does it mean for the Brexit negotiations? The session is going to be totally interactive. I'm going to ask Fabian and Janis some questions. I will be coming out to all of you in time-honored tradition for your questions and comments. You can do this in one of two ways. If you look to the right of your screen, you will see a hand button. You press that, and that's like as if we were all together in a room, metaphorically putting your hand up to ask a question. And then I will unmute you. You're muted most of the time, so we don't hear lots of background noise, but if I give you the floor, I will unmute you. I will say that I have unmuted you. You ask your question, and then could I ask you, please, either you or I will mute you again, as I say, to minimize interference. But if you don't want to do that, you can also click on the enter a question button. You'll also see that on the right-hand side there. Write in your question. It'll pop up on the screen in front of us, and I will take as many of those questions as possible. We won't wait till the end to do that. I will do that at various intervals over the next 60 minutes. I just ask you all, this is the first time I'm doing this, and only the third time the EPC has done this since the crisis began, so there may be a few technical glitches first time around, but let's see how we get on. So gentlemen, good morning. Let me just start really with an assessment of what this crisis means for the European Union. Some people are describing it as a make or break moment for the EU. Indeed, Guy Verhofstadt, in a commentary written for the EPC this week, said, and I quote, "If we choose business as usual, we will come out of this crisis devastated and broken." He also said, "But if we take the actions that are required to address these issues, we'll come out of the crisis stronger and more determined than ever before." Fabian, for you, is calling it a make or break moment about right, or is it slightly over dramatizing where we are now?
I think it is about right. When we look at the current situation, it is clearly dramatic. It has an impact on the whole of the European Union. People are looking also to the European level to see what is Brussels doing, what is Europe doing, how much solidarity is there, and if the EU is found wanting on this, it will have a very negative impact on the perception of people of how the EU functions, on the cooperation in Europe more general. I think what we are seeing now is a re-emergence of the polycrisis. We are in a situation where we have external influences which are very hard to control. There's a lot of uncertainty, and leadership is required as well. So far, we have had a mixed response. Some cooperation has worked, some of the things are happening. But I think we have to recognize that the scale of this crisis is also so big, and it's going to be long term. We will have to do a lot more than this.
Okay, we'll come back on that in just a moment. But Janis, your initial assessment of just how decisive a moment this is for the European Union.
No, I think it is a decisive moment. It is a difficult moment. On the other hand, I think we need to be careful not to rush to conclusions too quickly. Whether this will be make or break moment for the European Union is difficult to assess, because on the one hand, we do not know how long the immediate COVID-19 health crisis will last, and that will have an immense effect, the length of that crisis, on the other potential consequences of it. We know that there will be harsh economic, maybe even financial consequences of the crisis, but we don't know how deep that crisis will be. And that then also will determine how the recovery will be at a certain point in time later on. We do not know the societal consequences of all this within our societies, but also between our societies. So it's national and it's also transnational. We don't know the political implications. If this health crisis and all the subsequent consequences might lead to last for a long time, it might also have severe political consequences in individual member states. So we don't actually know how severe the effects will be and how severe the effects will be on the EU itself. But I think we should remember something, and Fabian was referring to the poly crisis, and I think he's right. We're seeing a re-emergence or a continuation of the poly crisis. That means that we should also be reminded of the fact that during the most difficult phases of the poly crisis we witnessed over the past decade and more, at the end of the day, the European Union has shown a high level of resilience. So even if things turn very negative, we should not assume from now that there will be maybe even an implosion of the EU, which some are even already arguing. So this is a fundamental challenge, a fundamental crisis, but I would not call it an existential crisis.
Okay, and turning to you co-authored a commentary last week on the crisis, and you warned, and again I'm quoting, active solidarity must be more than an empty slogan. And you said the EU must show it was ready to using that famous phrase, do whatever it takes. You outlined some recommendations for what you thought needed to be done, but just in terms of the EU's performance so far, there has been a lot of criticism. We'll come in a minute to the specifics of what happened yesterday in the teleconference, but do you think the criticisms are fair of what the EU has done, or given the limitations on its powers in this area and so on, are we being too harsh if we say, well, they haven't stepped up to the plate, they haven't done all the things we need to do, and therefore this is already deemed a failure of the European in terms of response? Janis first.
Yes and no. I think what we have witnessed up till now is actually three phases, or three moments, because the phases have been so short that it's not actually a phase. The initial response to the escalation of the COVID-19 crisis was that everyone was overwhelmed. And when you have an immediate crisis of that magnitude, what you see is that everyone is turning to the executive. Who is holding the competences, who is holding the powers, who can do something. And we saw that this was a difficult exercise also at national level. If you look into federal systems, like for example, my mother country, Germany, there was a struggle of who actually has now the executive in his or her hands. Is it Berlin or is it the Bundesländer? Who will take decisions, especially as health issues are more on the level of the German Länder? So you've had that rush to the executive, who were all overwhelmed. So I was not taken by surprise that also the European level was overwhelmed, because when it comes to health issues, it doesn't have the competences. When member states themselves are overwhelmed, this has an effect on how the EU is able to operate. So in the first moment, as a reaction to the crisis, I think we saw that chaos and that inability also at European level to coordinate. In the second moment, we saw that there was a reaction at European level. We saw extraordinary meetings of different council formations trying to coordinate, first and foremost, the health ministers. We saw that the general escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact was called into action in order to show more flexibility. We saw that there now is a temporary state aid framework in order to make sure that member states are able to support their companies to survive the situation. Flexible use of the budget. Funding for research, for example, to identify an effective vaccine for COVID. So we saw that the immediate reaction then took up, and that was the second moment. But now we're in the third moment, and there will be more to follow in 4 phases, which is how do we now deal with this crisis? What kind of exit strategy do we need? What kind of recovery plan do we need? And here, and I should have mentioned that in the second moment, the action of the ECB was very important. The fact that the ECB went for the PEP program, for the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, was a strong signal. But now you need something equivalent also from member states. And this is, and we will talk about that later, where we found ourselves yesterday, where there is need for coordination, where there are huge disagreements between member states. But now I think Europe will have to prove itself, and whether it's able, and member states have to prove themselves, whether they're able to find the right exit strategy.
Okay, and Fabian, on that point of yesterday, we know it was a very long teleconference. It lasted for over 5 hours. It was supposed to be a couple of hours or so, much longer and very fractious. We had afterwards, Portugal's Antonio Costa was talking about, he referred to a Dutch finance minister's remarks earlier in the week as senseless and repulsive. The sort of tempers were frayed, the language is harsh. Where do you see, I mean, what Janis was saying there, the things the EU has already done in terms of relaxing rules and so on, but this is the most difficult bit, what they were talking about yesterday, isn't it? This pooling of resources, it's been difficult since the first financial crisis. It remains very difficult now. What is your assessment of where we are and of what happened yesterday?
I think one thing yesterday highlights is that the first question we would have to ask is, who's actually the EU? Are we talking about what the EU institutions are doing, or are we talking about what the member states are doing? Are we talking about the kind of coordination which is thankfully happening more now across borders in terms of healthcare, or are we talking about the big economic response where most of the debate yesterday was? Clearly, there are huge differences between the member states. There is no common ground at the moment. This is not so surprising. It is unfortunate, but it continues a pattern we have seen ever since the economic crisis, that some countries are extremely reluctant to relax the fiscal rules, to have that pooling. In particular, it's not so much about the pooling of resources, it's about the pooling of liabilities. I think this is really where the ideological differences also are between the different countries. So it was, I think, over-optimistic to think that the Council yesterday could come to a conclusion on this. Clearly, there's a lot more which will have to be discussed here. There are many other areas which also have to progress. So we shouldn't be sidetracked to only focus on this issue, because there are many other issues where things also need to happen. But my take would be that, yes, for the moment, the member states are still very much apart on this issue. But we are also going to see, as the crisis gets deeper, and in particular, as the crisis starts to get deeper in economic terms, that there will be more voices which will call for a joint response. And in the end, we know that at the European level, we have deeply interdependent economies. There is no way that a crisis of this magnitude can be addressed by an economy on its own. There's no way an economy can actually shield itself from what is happening across borders. So my expectation is that necessity will continue to drive this debate. There will be a lot of resistance, but in the end, we don't have very many choices.
Okay,
Janis, what to get out of this crisis.
Sure, I'll come to you in a moment, Janis, about your assessment of what happened yesterday. But just to follow up on that, Fabian, so there was this north-south divide in the discussion, very clear yesterday. The South particularly wanting a reference in the conclusions to what have been called corona bonds. The North wanting a reference to the European Stability Mechanism as the key tool, the most appropriate tool to respond. As a result, neither was mentioned in the conclusions. So my question really is, they've sent finance ministers away, given them a couple of weeks to come up with what they call a pandemic crisis support tool, but they've given them no guidance really at all. There isn't a clear mandate. So how do you see this evolving over the next couple of weeks? And then same question to you, Janis. Fabian first.
I think that it is clear that the finance ministers are not going to magically come up with a solution. They already discussed this earlier in the week. They did not find common ground. So the idea that we put it back to the finance ministers now and that somehow will resolve the differences is, I think, an illusion. Maybe what is behind that, and this is what I would hope is going to happen over the next week, is that there is a bit more bilateral diplomacy, that there are talks between the president of the council, between certain member states, where there needs to be some movement, and that kind of what we would have called in normal times shuttle diplomacy, it's not going to be shuttle diplomacy, but telephone diplomacy, but that really takes place over the next 2 weeks, so that the member states can then give a stronger steer to the finance ministers of what they actually want to do. But I think what is important with respect to this debate, is it ESM, is it Corona bonds? I think the answer is both. And I think this is something we shouldn't actually be discussing in terms of only having one particular type of response. This is actually about having a vast array of different tools to try to address this. It's not so much about a bazooka, but it's about a battery of different tools to try to address this, given the type of impact we have. So yes, we should be talking about Corona bonds. We should also be talking about ESM, but we should be talking about many different areas. We should be talking about EU spending. We should be talking about what the EIB can do. We should talk about how we better coordinate the national actions which are being taken. So there's many different areas where common action now is necessary.
Janis, bazooka or a battery of measures? What do you think? What's your assessment of the outcome of yesterday? And are you reasonably confident? If I understand Fabian correctly, I think he's saying, yes, it's difficult, but that realization that we need this battery of measures will grow as the crisis continues, and therefore we shouldn't be too despondent at the outcome of yesterday's discussion. How do you see the way forward?
Maybe a couple of remarks. One is the expectations yesterday ahead of the VOICO, and I'll call it VOICO, the Video European Conference. Ahead of the VOICO was already rather low. Nobody should have expected that there would be a breakthrough. The differences between the member states, EU 27, Euro 19, are huge on the issue of how to show European fiscal solidarity. So it didn't come as a surprise. The unfortunate thing is that there was not even an indication of what sort of political guidance is given to the Eurogroup. So asking the Eurogroup to, within the next 2 weeks, come up with proposals is probably beyond the Eurogroup itself. The European Council is the decider of last resort, and it is the decider of last resort, especially at times of severe crisis. So it is beyond what finance ministers can decide. But Fabian is right. Within the next 2 weeks, we can hope that there will be shuttle diplomacy in a new form between member states, between national capitals, between the institutions and national capitals, to make progress, at least to get forward. Second remark is, I think we need to be careful to say that this is north-south. In the letter of the 9 asking for coronavirus bonds, there were also Belgium, Slovenia, Ireland, and Luxembourg. So it's not only the so-called southern member states who have been asking for a very strong reaction, and it's 9 out of the 19 Euro countries. In terms of what will come out, I think Fabian is right, and I would use another term. I would say that it's interlinked bazookas we need. We have seen that the ECB came forward with the PEP program, which actually is a very strong response and a quick response, even without having a strong political backing. So the ECB has clearly learned the lesson of past crises, which is put everything on the table, or as much as you can at a certain point on the table, in order to avert a spiraling out of control of a crisis. So they've learned the lesson, but now you need also other actions, whether it's the EIB to get involved, whether it's using the EU budget. But you also need something in terms of a European fiscal solidarity attempt between member states, especially among Eurogroup countries. And if you don't have that, the danger is that you undermine what you're doing with respect to the other bazookas. So that's why I'm saying it's interlinked bazookas. Now, with respect to the concrete options we have on the table, there are at least three. There are some who think maybe status quo is enough, maybe what the ECB has done is enough. Member states can refinance themselves. The yields went down after what the ECB did. So let's see how things will develop and then decide what to do. I personally think that's not the right thing to do, taking into account the experiences of the past. Second option is to use the ESM and the precautionary credit lines of the ESM. But that would mean that the debt of countries who are already highly indebted would even increase. So for a country like Italy, this is not actually the solution. And then there's the Corona bonds idea, to have a joint debt issuance for crisis expenditures, where everyone stands for that. And if you spend that money more for the countries hit most, that actually means that you have some form of fiscal transfer in a very particular situation. This is an external shock. There's nobody's fault. Coronavirus hit all of us. It is symmetric. The effects are asymmetric, but it is symmetric. So you also need to react to it in a different way than you did. But just the last point, and I know I'm too long, but I think what we need to be careful is that we don't fall into old reflexes. Because what we're seeing now is that we're seeing that some of the member states who have been calling for Eurobonds in the past are now doing the same, and those who in the past have said, no, we're against it, are now again against it. So we have these old reflexes, but we have a new situation. So old reflexes are not the right thing to have in mind these days.
Just one other issue we haven't talked about specifically in relation to yesterday's teleconference, which was the question of an exit strategy. The European Commission has been tasked with developing an exit strategy. The idea being here that while we've gone into various forms of lockdown in different member states at different times in different ways, we need to coordinate how we come out of that. Otherwise, Ursula von der Leyen said yesterday, we risk undermining the effects of the tough measures that have been introduced in member states. How realistic is it at this point, given that each member state is wrestling with such difficult questions and trying to calibrate their own responses in relation to what's happening in their specific circumstances? How realistic is it now to talk about a coordinated exit strategy? Fabian.
I think we clearly are in the middle of a development where, and it's sometimes easy to forget that for many countries, this experience of lockdown is rather recent. It feels like a very long time, but we are really talking about a week and a half. Whereas in other countries, we have had a very severe situation. In Italy, more localized, but it seems to be unfortunately spreading there as well. So we are at very different stages in this crisis. We also had very different responses. In some countries, there still is a reluctance to go for the most extreme versions of a lockdown, of closing down activities. So of course it's extremely difficult to coordinate that. But I think we also have to move away from the idea that we will get to an endpoint with this, that somehow in a few weeks' time, whatever that point is, there's then an exit strategy, and then the crisis is over and we go back to normal. That is, I think, very unlikely. From what I understand of how this virus is going to work, is that it's actually much more about having a risk management strategy for the whole of the European Union, where we will have to deal with the emergence of the outbreak in some places, where we have to deal with localized difficulties. So it's not only about coordinating the exit, it is really about coordinating the response. And that also means coordinating how we respond in terms of healthcare systems, making sure that even when we are out of this immediate emergency situation, that we have the ability to put the resources where they are most needed at whatever point that is necessary. So I think what this all speaks to is actually this is not about a simple change to have a strategy which is in place. It is about changing the way we interact on these issues and having an overall approach of risk management which can deal with this particular virus, but also can deal with future pandemics. I think we shouldn't forget that the likelihood that we will have future pandemics is very high.
Yeah, and indeed that links to a question that has already been asked via our various mechanisms for doing that, about we are seeing, as Janis mentioned, a lot of EU principles and instruments being in some form suspended, or you mentioned state aid, Janis, obviously Schengen and free movement and so on. So that need for a strategy, a way to say in future crises, how do we deal with decisions on whether to relax those rules, we will need to develop. Janis, just a quick word, if you would, on the exit strategy question, and then I'm seeing a few questions already coming in via writing. Remember, you can do that by pressing the enter a question button, or you can click the little hand on the right hand side of your panel. I will magically hopefully see that you have raised your hands in a virtual sense and give you the floor in a moment. But Janis, your thoughts briefly on the exit strategy, if you would.
I think the exit strategy, or risk management strategy, as Fabian called it, is key. I think this is now going to actually determine how also we will be at the end of the day perceiving the European Union. You need a coordinated exit strategy, and you need it with respect to different dimensions. I think what we always have to have in mind is that the health crisis is the most severe challenge we are now facing. That is the most severe challenge we now need to be dealing with. And if you look into the situation in Italy or in Spain and other countries where unfortunately the situation is much more severe than it is in those countries who are now more fortunate, that's what we need to concentrate on. But in order to deal with this, we need to create clarity, and we do not have clarity. We have different reactions in different member states in different phases. And you need more clarity in terms of what will happen in future. You need it because that's a prerequisite in order to uphold some of the drastic measures you have been taken. You need also clarity for economic reasons in terms of telling people how things will develop, when they can expect that they will go back to a new normal. It's not the old normal, to a new normal. And you also need it psychologically, because some of the actions taken are putting a strain on societies. That exit strategy has to think, as Fabian was indicating, of the different ways we will be experiencing. This will not be over in a couple of weeks. And if you listen to epidemiologists, to virologists, to doctors, they will tell you that we will probably face different phases. And we will also be facing different phases maybe in individual countries. There will be different hotspots. And I think we need an exit strategy coordinated among member states, which tells us what you do in which phase of the crisis in future. So it's not only exiting, but managing, as Fabian said, that crisis. And you need a mechanism for that, which is clear, which is understandable, and which is agreed upon by all member states. I hope that we will not have a differentiated exit strategy, because we know that some member states are dealing with the health crisis in different ways. So they might also want to do that in future. But we need that strong, coordinated exit strategy.
Okay, linked to that, and I'm just going to pick up on some of the written questions that we have. There's a question here about the relationship really between the G20 and the EU. So the international level, coordination of response to the extent that there is any, and the European level. How do you see the link between those two things? Let's take that one. As I say, I'm going to take them individually because I think in this format it's easier, but brief replies if you would, because a lot of questions are coming in. So in terms of the G20 and their discussions on this and the EU discussions, how do you see the relationship between the two? Who can come in on that one? Fabian, anything to say?
I think clearly the more globally we can coordinate, the better. This is a global crisis and it requires a global response. I think it helps if you have that global emphasis, but I wouldn't overestimate how much cooperation, how much coordination is possible at that level. There are big differences. I think there will also be, frankly, political differences which will emerge, given that, for example, the crisis is starting to really hit in the United States. What is going to be the response of the Trump administration? Are we going to see a blame game? Yes, let's try to coordinate as much as possible, but let's not overestimate what will come out of that.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question really of an assessment. Janis, you talked about, and Fabian also talked about the return of the poly crisis, which we went into and was a term you very much coined at the time of the financial and economic crisis. How do you compare the EU's response now to its response back in 2008 to 2010, when we saw that series of emergency European councils, that evolving response? How would you assess what happened then and what is happening now? It may be too early to answer that, but your first feeling.
No, I think it is too early. We're just in the beginning, I fear, of the COVID-19 crisis and the consequences of that, the multiple consequences of that. So it's too early to say. I think there's one thing which is positive, which is that I think taking the experience of the past crises, there is an increasing understanding that if you see such a severe challenge in front of you, you need to react quickly and forcefully. So what I said earlier with respect to the ECB, I think that's the strongest signal at European level. But also if you look into the national level, a lot of member states have done things which 3, 4, 5 weeks ago we would not have thought would be possible. Even in Germany, where the black zero had been a mantra, this no longer is now the policy, because you see that that doesn't work. So we see that there are severe reactions and quick reactions at European and national level, and you will need more of that. On the negative, you also see, and this is one of the links which I would make to the poly crisis, that we see all reflexes, as I said earlier. We see that people feel reminded of what has happened in the past. People are making connections between what kind of reaction there was to the migration refugee management crisis or to the euro area crisis over the past decade, and people feel reminded and use it as an argument to say, look, this is happening again. We're not seeing solidarity. We're not being supported. Everyone's egoistic in its reaction to the crisis. So people are reminded of the past, and that's a link to the poly crisis. The severity of the crisis is another link. That's why I would call it being part of the poly crisis, and the multidimensional nature of the COVID-19 crisis. So there are a lot of resemblances, but actually to make a final assessment, I think, is impossible at this point in time.
Okay, let us just take one other for the moment. There are a lot of questions, and I think in the coming weeks in this webinar, we will come back on the impact of this crisis in different areas of policy. But I'm seeing questions related to the impact of all of this on the European Green Deal, on the Future of Europe conference, on the EU's social pillar and what it should look like. As I say, I hope we'll be able to come back on some of these specifics in future discussions, but just a broad comment maybe for now and this week in terms of how you see the impact, the knock-on effects on many different areas, and I say we'll come back and delve into them in more detail. And after that, I'm going to try and take a couple of questions from those with their hands up in the virtual world. So this knock-on effect on other policies, who would like to come in first? Fabian? Yeah.
I think firstly, the most immediate impact is going to be that everything else is subordinate to dealing with the immediate crisis, and that the response in many ways will be firefighting. It will be very hard to come up with any long-term responses, with thinking through strategies, with thinking through how that might impact in the longer term. This is about reacting, and reacting fast, and also reacting at a level, at a scale which is appropriate to the crisis. So everything else for the moment will drop off the agenda. It doesn't mean that we have abandoned the objectives which are there. It doesn't mean that these are not important. It just means that for the moment there is no space on the agenda to think about these in the longer term. But of course there are interrelations between the response to the crisis and a number of those policy areas. So if we are looking at the Green Deal, of course it is good to see investment which is now going to come, public money which is going to come, to go as much as possible into green investments, into areas which help us also in terms of the longer term changes which are needed. But for the moment, I think the focus will be as much as possible on quick reaction, quick spending, not thinking too much about the long term, and also recognizing the very difficult personal situation many people are in. So there needs to be immediate help. If whatever our long-term goals are in terms of, for example, the social pillar, what matters now is that we get help to people as non-bureaucratically as possible, as quickly as possible, and whether that comes from the local level, the national level, the European level, the important thing is that the help is coming, and not what kind of system we have in place.
And the two most obvious areas, one we do have a question on already, but is the multi-annual financial framework. A question from someone in the audience: do you think there is now a chance for a bigger MFF closer to the European Parliament's numbers? I know that you, in your commentary last week, talked about the possibility that the MFF would have to be rolled over, that we can't reach a deal under the current circumstances. And indeed, Marta Pilati, an EPC policy analyst, will be publishing a commentary later on today on this topic. But Fabian, are you saying we should accept the inevitable, if you like, and say we're not going to reach a deal under these circumstances, so roll it over? Or are you saying we should go on trying, but we need to be ready to roll it over? And if we do, what would the implications of that be?
I think in some policy areas we can afford to wait a bit, we can afford to delay, because there's no immediate need to react, and those are the policy areas where we will return to them in future. But when we look at something like the multi-annual financial framework, we do not have that choice. The multi-annual financial framework is already late. We are already in a situation where the programs next year will start late, even if we were able to agree it now. And the reality is that there's neither the political space at the moment, nor is there an agreement on the fundamentals, which would enable us to get to an agreement on the MFF within the next few weeks. I think it is unfortunate. I would very much favor a first best solution where we have a new MFF, which is ambitious, which does deal with all of the new policy areas, and which also does better deal with the crisis we are facing at the moment. So rolling this over is very much second best. It is not the ideal solution. And if member states can get together and come to a quick decision, then that would be far preferable. But I think we have to be realistic. And I don't see that happening at the moment. In this world of second best, it is better that we have an MFF in place, even if it isn't fully addressing the challenges, even if it isn't of the appropriate size. But the alternative is that we have no MFF, that it continues to be there as a political bone of contention, that we have programs which will be delayed. We might not even get to an agreement at the end of the year. I think the assumption that because of this immense pressure on national governments, that actually makes it easier to agree an MFF, I would question. There are many things here where if you are under fiscal pressure already, to then agree to an ambitious MFF is very difficult at the domestic level. So I think for this emergency situation, we need an emergency MFF, and the easiest way of doing that is rolling over the current MFF by a year. It is not the best solution, but in my view, it's all we can actually achieve at this moment.
Okay, we've got lots of questions coming in. Janis, a word on the MFF, and then I'm going to take a couple from the floor.
No, I think the MFF for an emergency budget for 2021 is, under the current circumstances, the best option you have, because now trying to get an agreement on the MFF in the current situation is impossible. It's politically impossible. Trying to get one later on in the year might prove to be even more difficult than it was a couple of weeks ago, because we see that the opposing camps now having a discussion about what kind of fiscal solidarity we need between member states were also to some extent opposing camps in the MFF debate. So we might even have a more poisoned discussion with respect to the MFF. So creating certainty now, saying that we are aware of the difficulties, but we still will need an annual budget 2021. So we need to prepare for that early on in order to create certainty, at least with respect to having that on the table, I think is very important. Just one word, because you mentioned it, that it was mentioned in one of the questions related to the conference on the future of Europe.
Yeah.
This is something which we at the EPC have been dealing with for a while and rather extensively. We have seen over the past months that this is a thing difficult to start flying, and there were a lot of problems, but given the current situation, this is being put on ice, and this is the right thing to do, to put it on ice, while at the same time still continuing to think about it, because I think at some moment in time also reflecting what we're now going through in the context of the COVID-19 crisis will affect the conference on the future of Europe. So one should not only put it on ice, but one should also at the same time continue thinking about making progress in terms of at least preparing it. We already knew that not everything had been prepared, so use the time also for the conference, but now it's being put on ice, and that's correct.
We'll come back, as I say, I hope in future weeks, and also on the question of the social pillar and all of those issues. But I want to attempt to take some questions from the floor. Malcolm Harbour, if you're there, I think you are. I'm going to unmute your microphone and let's see if we can have your question. So, Malcolm, are you? It's not letting me at the moment unmute you. Don't know why. No, we have some little wizards working in the background here, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes. Am I connected?
Yes.
Yes, we're talking.
Very warm welcome, Malcolm.
Well, good morning, everybody. I follow with great interest. I just want to make a broader point. From my isolation, being over 70 now, I'm confined to home completely. But it seems to me that the European Commission is the one major organization which has the bandwidth and analytical capability available to start thinking about the transition. My observation from here is that governments are completely absorbed with dealing with the day-to-day challenges. And it seems to me that the Commission has a real opportunity here to be starting to address in what is an incredibly uncertain world. But I mean, there are going to be major issues that are going to have to be tackled straight away, like the future of the airlines, about transport, about the fact that people have been seriously disturbed by the vulnerability of current economic structures. and also the way that we're using this technology differently. And surely this is the one area where, and I agree completely, for heaven's sake, have a short-term budget. But actually, policy making has stopped, but there's lots of brain power around the place. And I think there's a big role for EPC and others to try and corral some people together. So a lot of us have some extra time on our hands to be able to contribute to these discussions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Joe Linen, can I get you up and unmuted? There we go.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. Very interesting webinar, I must say. Now, I hope that the EU gets stronger by this crisis as well. And my question would be, in case all the measures by ECB, EIB, EU funding is not enough, and we come to the point that fiscal solidarity would be really necessary, is it possible that we do it by enhanced cooperation? And I asked that question because Mark Rutte was quoted yesterday that any sort of bonds, Euro bonds, are against the nature of the EU, and the Netherlands would never agree. So you have really hardliners, and you might have others who come in 1, 2, 3 weeks when the situation is good. A second idea on the exit strategy. I'm living here on the border to France, and I see how arbitrary borders are closed and not even with logic. And there's a lot of let's say we are the most Europeans, but here they are afraid of French people. So nationalism and all these psychological things are in the room, and we need a common exit strategy. Maybe specified groups of people that could go out and go to work or whatever, and that must be coordinated in the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take one more for now, see if we can squeeze in some later, but I do also want to come to the question of Brexit before we end our session. Philippe de Boek, are you there? Can you speak to us?
I'm there.
Hello,
Do
Philippe.
you hear me? Thank you, Fabian and Janis. Janis used the expression "the new normal" for the future, and perhaps it's too early now to define what the new normal will be. But I would like to take two elements where we should reflect on, and perhaps already to have the comments of Fabian and Janis. One is on globalization. When I read the G20 final conclusions, they say we need to have a global approach, but also to leave our markets open and to have a global trade. And I think where others are saying the globalization is one of perhaps the reasons of this pandemic. And the second element is about the behavior of people. We are all locked down, we have health problems, and that is something where people are really eager to find solutions. And from where should the solutions come, and what can the European Union do in order to give the impression at least that they protect the people on the one hand, but also I think that the people will react and not accept anymore all this chaos and chaotic approaches. And I would like to have the impressions of Fabian and Janis. Thank you very much, and thank you for this.
Thank you very much. I want to just throw a couple more questions into the mix because we don't have long. On the MFF, people are asking as follow-ups to what you said earlier. Do you think the Commission will make a new proposal, so start all over again in light of what is happening? And also, what for you is the worst case scenario? Is it worse to have no agreement and carry over, as you've suggested, this rollover, or is it worse to have a rushed MFF that leaves many issues unresolved? So, gentlemen, we don't have long. Fabian, I would like to come back on the question of Brexit. So can I ask you to pick up on the points from those many questions most relevant to you and to be brief? Janis, I'll come to you first, and then Fabian, I'll come to you, and we'll throw also Brexit into that mix if we might. Fabian first, Janis first, sorry.
Okay, let me start with the question related to the exit management strategy and the new normal, how to deal with lockdown. I think, and we already indicated that earlier, that this actually is a centerpiece of what now needs to be done at European level. you need to do that in a coordinated fashion. There was an example given with respect to border regions that showed us clearly that if one member state takes certain decisions and the others doesn't, that has knock-on effects on the other country. So people when shops were closed in one country, went to the other to go shopping on a Saturday. That fostered then also decisions to install border controls. That's just one example. So you need an exit management strategy which is coordinated at European level. It doesn't make sense to have national strategies. At the same time, you need to reflect the fact that you have different, and will have, we said earlier, there will be different phases, different waves of the COVID-19 challenge also in future. So you will have to adapt measures also to the needs in certain member states at certain hotspots in certain regions of Europe. But you need to coordinate that so that there is clarity of actually what is being done, and that you know what is being done in a given situation in another member state. So if you're at a certain alert level in a certain member state, you know what that means in terms of the rules that apply in that country, and that you are aware of what you need to do if you then go to that country, what it would mean if you would go to that country. So you need that clarity, and that is genuinely something which has to be done at the European level. So here we need, and here especially the Commission, and President von der Leyen has indicated that they're working on that exit strategy, to come up with proposals, practical proposals on how to deal with that, always coordinated with those people who know best, which are the people who know how this virus works. And we're still finding out how it works. So there needs to be a strong coordination with them. With respect to having enhanced cooperation with respect to showing European fiscal solidarity, I think we need to be careful here, because if we would have some form of fiscal solidarity using certain mechanisms, and it doesn't include all countries, all members of the Eurozone, for example, I think that would send a very dangerous signal. It would undermine all the other efforts, as I said earlier, the interlinked bazookas. So if you have enhanced cooperation, between a good number of countries with respect to showing fiscal solidarity, that could undermine efforts which are being taken in other contexts. So I think I would be very careful not to move in that direction. On the other hand, we're going to be seeing probably that the Euro 19 will be things which will not involve non-Eurozone countries. And there was someone who asked a question about non-Eurozone countries. And I think we need to be careful that we don't create a new divide, meaning that we have mechanisms in place which work for the Eurozone but exclude others. So we also need to be careful not to create this kind of differentiated solidarity, which then has negative trigger effects with respect to fiscal solidarity, but also with respect to other policy areas.
And issues.
So we really need to be careful.
Yeah, issues we can come back on in future weeks. Fabian, you may want to pick up on some of the points made there, but I really do want to ask you, and we only have 5 minutes left, about Brexit. Because in another commentary that you published this week, you insisted that the extension of the transition period, you said, and I quote, was an absolute must. Why do you now believe it is an absolute must? And how likely do you think it is, firstly, that the UK will request one, however much they insist now that they won't, and that the EU, even if that request comes rather late, comes after the notional deadline of June to make that request, how likely is it that the EU would agree? So why is it so important, and how do you see this debate unrolling?
Just to pick up a couple of other points from the questions, and then I'll get to Brexit. But in terms of long-term thinking, in terms of strategies of long-term transition, how do we get out of this? Absolutely, I fully agree with Malcolm there. This is something where we can do this at the European level, and by that I don't just mean the institutions. I do mean think tanks. I do mean the broader policy community, and certainly from an EPC perspective. That is something we are going to be focusing on over the next month. So anyone who also wants to work with us, who has ideas about putting something on paper, then now is the time. And we seem to be able to organize some things electronically as well. So we might have workshops, etc., on some of those issues. I think what is important in terms of the MFF is that we are realistic. Yes, I'm not happy with the idea that we have the old MFF simply rolled over, but we have to be realistic in the current situation. And if there's no agreement, it is much worse not to have something in place. Not only because it will take up continuous bandwidth. We will have to deal with the MFF continuously. At least if we roll over by a year, then we can also postpone the political discussions around that. But also because it will be very difficult to build things on the spending if there is no new MFF in place. And we need new programs, we need more flexibility within programs. There has to be a very different way of spending European money. But to do that without at least having a basic backbone of having the fundamental agreement on the rollover, I think is impossible. And in many ways, this is actually also the argument in the Brexit context. There is just no way we can negotiate meaningfully at the current point in time. And the differences which are there between the two sides haven't gone away. So we need some time to properly negotiate, to come to areas of compromise, to come to areas where we might disagree. And we can't do that. We can't do that at the moment because there are no negotiations. Effectively, the negotiations have stopped, and it's very difficult to believe they will start anytime soon. But we also have to take the longer term into account. Whatever the wishes of the UK government are in terms of the long-term relationship between the UK and the EU, there will be a disruption, there will be a change the moment the UK exits the transition period. And to have that disruption at a time of economic crisis is, in my view, reckless. And that is why I have said it is an absolute must that we postpone it, so that we do have the time for the negotiations and that the economic consequences don't come.
And very briefly, your reading of the politics of this right now, do you expect that the UK will recognise that inevitability and will make that application or not?
Well, the EU certainly has recognized that this is necessary. That is what you hear everywhere, that it is essentially for the UK to ask, but it would be a relatively easy process if the UK did. But on the UK side, the hurdles are much higher. We shouldn't forget that the UK government has put not asking for an extension into legislation. So there would have to be a change in the legislation to enable this. Ideally, this would have to happen before the end of June, given that is the official deadline. So there's a big political hurdle on the UK side. For the moment, the UK is not asking. But I think there are discussions behind the scenes, and in some ways, going back also to what we were saying in terms of fiscal solidarity, necessity will drive a lot of this. And I think what the UK government is seeing now is that the interdependence is still extremely high. And that, for example, when it comes to food supplies, that exiting the single market at this moment in time would also have a very detrimental effect in terms of providing some of the basic necessities or making the country function. So I would expect there will be movement in the UK, but it will take some time, and we have to prepare for a moment that it might be after the end of June deadline that the UK finally asks, and then we have to find a way of accommodating that.
Okay. One of the many issues I'm sure we're going to come back on in the weeks to come. There were a few more questions. I got most of you in, but there were some questions which maybe we can return to next week about the impact on liberal democracy in Europe, the debate about, you know, whether it is the more authoritarian regimes that are better equipped to solve the crisis, and if people see that or believe that, what is the response going to be? Lots of issues to come back on. We will, I hope, return to the Green Deal, bearing in mind what you've said about everything else is on hold temporarily, but you've also said how important it is to continue those discussions on these issues and to use this time profitably. So we will come back, I hope, on all of that. It only remains for me to thank Fabian and Janis very much indeed. I'd like to thank the wizards at the EPC, Natalie and Clara, who got all this on the road and are making it work fantastically well. Thank you to all of you for joining in, both by listening, but also with your questions and comments both ways round. I have to say the technology worked much better than I had expected for a first round. So we look forward to as many of you as possible joining us same time, same place next week. In the meantime, please stay safe and have a good weekend despite the circumstances. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you.
And somehow I turn this off.